Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to bring the conversation I had with Arik Kershenbaum. Arik is a zoologist and lecturer at the University of Cambridge. He has his Bachelors in Natural Sciences from the University of Cambridge and PhD in Evolutionary Biology and Ecology from the University of Haifa in Israel. His main research interests are in acoustic communication systems in different animals. He's also done some work with the hyrax, which we talk about. He is the author of the latest book, Why Animals Talk, The New Science of Animal Communication. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. I loved his book. I'm always very excited to talk about animal communication and really just about anything that has to do with evolutionary biology or anything in that world. So it was a real treat to talk with him. We start by talking about the differences between language and communication in animals. How can we respectfully communicate with animals? We cover the 6 animals that he talks about in the book to understand communication. We talk about howling in wolves and how it's pretty individualized and how they do that from distance. The clicks in dolphins, comprehension in parrots, singing with the hyrax and gibbons, chimps, and we also talk about humans and how we communicate and many other topics. I really enjoyed this conversation. Arik is such a wonderful thinker. He's a brilliant writer. He does some really, really good and fascinating research. And I think the wonderful thing about this is there's still a lot to uncover. The scientists, researchers are still exploring this. This stuff is still in its infancy. And he has such a wonderful attitude about that. Of saying like, yeah, I've done some stuff. Here's my research, but there's still a lot of questions. We're a lot figuring out. And that's, I think, what is always super important to have that kind of approach. And the work he's done already is pretty magnificent. So it's really, really nice to talk with him about some of the ideas, speculate a little bit, what we can know, and what we can maybe try to keep asking. So it was just a lovely conversation all around. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. Like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends, contribute. All that's much appreciated. And now I bring you Arik Kershenbaum. I am here with Arik Kershenbaum. Arik, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to talking with you about your research and your work. So big thanks for coming on.
Great to be here. Happy to talk.
Yes. So you've written a really awesome book. I really, really enjoyed it. It's called Why Animals Talk, The New Science of Animal Communication. And on this side of the pond, it's through Penguin Press. I'm not sure who put it out on the other side over there, but it's been out in the UK or in other countries earlier this summer, right? Am I right on this?
It's been out since January in the UK, yeah.
That's right, yeah. And I think over here in the US, it's out in August, And so it's some people have read it, I guess, and other people are going to read it. So that's a good thing. So we'll talk all about it, all about animal communication. Before we do, why don't you just tell listeners kind of who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to.
So I'm a zoologist, and I'm based at the University of Cambridge in England, and I work on animal communication, which means that I don't specialize on any one particular species, but I look at all kinds of animals, how they communicate, what they mean, if they mean anything, why and how they evolved to have the communication that they do. And I do that partly because it's really interesting and we really want to know what these animals are saying, partly because it tells us quite a lot about who we are as humans and how we evolved our really, really quite unique language. But also increasingly I'm finding that it's a really useful conservation tool. So we're using sound a lot to work with endangered animals and try and understand why perhaps they're not doing as well as they could be. So those are the main directions that I work in.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And has it always been zoology, or did you? Some people they start out in one field and they kind of find themselves in another place, or has that just been the career track the whole way?
No, I actually come from a background that's a little bit more technical. So I started out in this field more in the direction of mathematical biology, so theoretical evolution
Oh,
and
nice.
game theory and things like that. Because I
Right
come
on.
from a more sort of technological high-tech background as well. But
Mm,
it's a really useful, it's a really useful combination, especially today
mhm,
when just about everything, just about every form of research, it generates a lot of data using a lot of AI and a
mhm,
lot of data processing. And so you're finding that a lot of scientists from every field coming up
mm,
are finding that sort of software algorithm background to be really, really useful.
mm. Yeah, that's great. It's great to have that perspective on it when studying. I mean, there's people that do kind of the strict kind of biological perspective or zoology perspective. So having a more technical side of things is great. Especially, I think it's absolutely right. As the world's changing and evolving, and we're integrating many other types of systems. That's wonderful. So I guess the first question when I started reading the book, I was interested in this is I've talked with other folks here on the podcast that have loosely been interested in animal communication as well, and the question that always comes up, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this, is we have this distinction of sorts of, as humans, we tend to be, or many humans, not all, but can be pretty arrogant. We're special, we're unique on the planet, blah, blah, blah. And one of the reasons people say that, some people say that, I don't necessarily agree with that, but is, we have this thing of language. It's like, well, we can talk to each other and use words and have these sounds come out of our mouths and we make sentences and, all these things. And that's certainly wonderful, but, or can be, but how do you make this distinction between language and communication, right? Because it seems obvious that animals aren't communicating, but they're not using necessarily language the way we are. And I don't think it needs to be a kind of juxtaposition between, well, humans and all other animals. But how do we, a lot of people are very careful to say it's not necessarily language, or it might be their kind of language, but they are communicating. How do you make this distinction between language and communication?
Yeah. Well, it is a controversial subject. I tend to think the controversy is a little distracting. We need to
Mm,
observe what's actually going on and describe and understand why things are the way they are without worrying too much about labels. But the first point is all animals communicate, right? All animals communicate. There's no doubt. It's the nature of being an animal.
mm,
Animals move. Animals need to move around to get their food. Plants don't, obviously. And once you're moving around, then you need to be able to communicate with other members of your species. At the very least, you need to be able to find a mate, right? So, so all animals communicate in some way or another. That's just the nature of animals. Now, clearly, some animals communicate more in a more complex way and some in a less complex way. And whether or not we choose to draw a line and say, okay, everything beyond this point is language and less complex than this is not language, I'm not sure how useful that is.
mm,
There is something about humans that is unique. There is something about humans that is unique that undoubtedly is different from the way all other animals communicate. Humans can convey an unlimited number of concepts. There is no limit to the number of ideas that you can express or that have been expressed in all the books that have ever been published. There's no
mhm,
limit. And
mhm,
that's not the case for any other species as far as we know. Now, I happen to think that's a useful distinction, that's a really interesting phenomenon, that humans have this sort of unlimited communicative ability and other animals don't seem to. So I personally don't have a problem drawing the line there and saying, look, if you can communicate any number of concepts, let's call that language.
mhm,
But as I said, it's much more important to understand why humans have this. And other animals don't seem to do that. Now, it's interesting that there are some species that might be able to do that.
mm,
And certainly when you teach parrots or chimpanzees to communicate with humans, you get the sense that they have that ability, but they don't do it. They don't do it in the
mm.
wild. And this is where all the evolutionary mechanisms come in because, hey, it's a difficult thing to do. And if it's not really useful to you as a species, then it doesn't give you an advantage. And that's why they don't do it.
Mm, yeah, it's super interesting that maybe there's at the very least, an elementary level compared to us that maybe a few species could do, but for some reason maybe they don't, or they choose not to, which is really, really interesting. I guess with the juxtaposition again with humans, we seem to be very curious to want to talk to other animals, right? I think everyone's had this kind of fun thought experiment about what would it be like if if my dog or my cat was able to talk back to me or tell me things, or we could have conversations or something. And I think just generally, I think how humans want to communicate at the very least with other animals, and in some ways I guess we do, right, non-verbally or through other ways. But how can we respect animals in how they communicate with each other and with us as humans, and how do we kind of learn and study from other animals and how they communicate, but still not try to anthropomorphize too much or always make it a comparison with humans? How do we have the interaction with humans communicating with other animals?
Yeah, I agree. And there's a simple answer to your question, how do we do that? And that is, you have to understand why the animals are communicating. So it is true that we tend to impose our ideas about language and about communication on animals, our ideas as humans, what we use language for, onto animals that don't do the same things as we do, right? They don't build houses, they don't have cities, they don't have books, they don't have podcasts. So trying to impose our ideas of what communication is for might not be the best way to go about it. If you're talking about domestic animals like dogs, then there is a sense in which that is relevant because they live with us, they live in a society with us, and there's an element of necessary communication between us. So we do understand that we can communicate with our dogs, and we do develop ways for them to understand us and us to understand them. When it comes to animals in the wild, though, that's a different story. You've just got to remember why they're talking. Why are they communicating? And if you have a species, this is something that comes up again and again. This is really, in many ways, the core of the issue. If you have a species that is highly social, that lives in very complex social groups with complex interactions between the individuals, they will have complex communication. They need complex communication. If you have animals that live more or less on their own and only come together to mate or once a year or something like that, they'll have a less complex communication system. So it's important to think about what they need their communication for before we try and understand it and interpret it.
Is there, you tell me if I'm making a jump too far here, but is there a correlation you think between social animals or animals that are in more complex social arrangements and the need for complex communication or more complex communication, that there's a kind of interaction there, or main interaction there between high sociality or more complex sociality and communication? Is that fair to make that correlation?
Yeah, it's not a correlation, it's a causation. And there's actually a mechanism that the communication, complex communication and complex society go hand in hand. They evolve together hand in hand. As society becomes more complex, should it be advantageous to do so, right? Not all animals live in complex societies.
Right.
But if in a particular environment, in a particular niche, it's really advantageous to live in a complex society, maybe there are lots of important things that need to be done together, or you need to cooperate or something like that, then complex communication evolves together with that. And what we've seen, particularly in humans, is that as that complex communication evolves, more complex sociality is possible. And then more complex communication is necessary, and so on.
We'll get to it, but this is what makes the parrot story very interesting, right? Because it doesn't seem like they have big complex societies with other parrots, like wolves or chimpanzees or whatever. So we'll get to the parrot, but it's very interesting how there's these different modes of maybe an element of convergent evolution there. So it's interesting. So I want to ask, you have 6 animals you discuss in the book. I should say 6 non-human animals, and then you give a chapter for us humans. I'm sure there were many animals you could have chosen, but why did you choose these 6? And were there other animals maybe you wanted to write about or talk about, but just couldn't or didn't fit or whatever reason. So yeah, why did these animals make the cut, and what animals kind of got on the cutting floor, I guess?
Well, there were really two considerations there. One is that they needed to fit into some sort of narrative that I'm trying to portray about where communication comes from, why it occurs, the different levels of complexity. So I wanted a range of complexities. I wanted animals that were all relatively complex, but to show that the sort of gradation that you see as not just as societies become more complex, but also complex in different ways. You know, some of the animals I chose have complex communication, but without much meaning in that communication, whereas others have complex communication and meaning. So I did want that range. But kind of more importantly, I wanted animals that I've worked with in the field. Because I really think that you just cannot understand why animals are talking, what they're saying. You can't understand that without understanding how they live. And so a big part of the book is narrative about what it's like with these animals in the wild, what they behave like in the wild, where they live, how they live. This is what gives us the sort of the basis of where this communication comes from. What are they doing out there? And a lot of the animals, you know, they're ones that people are not that familiar with. Who's been out to see gibbons in the wild? Right? Very, very few people. So you got to understand that the niche they live in, the world they occupy, and how they occupy that world. That's what's driving their behavior.
Was there any animals you wanted to talk about but just didn't have the time or space or didn't quite fit? Was there one or two that you wish you could have maybe put in there?
I mean, there was a lot of. I thought a lot about this, the fact that almost all of the animals, except for the parrots, are mammals. And it might have been nice to add some non-mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, and so on. But that would have tripled the size of the book. Maybe. I think you know, the main message that I was trying to get across was about this link between sociality and communication. And there's no doubt that mammals really sort of they have a bit of a monopoly on that social complex communication. Although you can find certainly in social insects there's a lot of interesting communication. Sure, but I think that might have been like taking a bit of a detour.
Yeah, no. I mean, there is a even though they're different animals. I mean, you're right, mostly mammals, but there is a very nice kind of cohesive narrative that goes through. So it is the effect you want. It definitely hits. So it's great. So you start with wolves. I guess the main question I have here with wolves, you can talk about their howls and stuff for a minute, but I mean, I think it's most people kind of, you know, sort of casually know that, you know, they're a pack animal, they're pretty social. I guess, what is it that makes them so communal and cooperative? They have close bonds with each other. What is it about wolves, as opposed to maybe even other similar animals, that gives them that kind of communal, cooperative kind of pack that they have with each other?
Well, of course, every animal adapts to its niche, to the way that it finds its finds its living, essentially. And wolves are incredibly adaptable. I mean, they're one of the most, if not the most, adaptable predator that there is. You find them all over the world. In deserts, you find them in the Arctic. You know, they really can adapt to different environments, and that's their niche. Their niche is to be able to make their living pretty much anywhere. And that requires a lot of cooperation, because if you're bringing down, you know, a massive bison, or if you're struggling to find whatever food exists in the desert, you know, there's a lot of cooperation that's needed. So their adaptation, what makes them special, is the cooperation. Cooperate to solve these problems, cooperate to solve the problems of finding food and maintaining a territory. You see examples of that, you know, in pretty much every lineage. There are really effective cooperative generalists in most different types of animals. But in the carnivores, the wolves are really that example of the ones who can go out and pretty much live anywhere, because they have that flexibility. They're incredibly flexible.
That's a really interesting connection there between adaptability and cooperation, which is, I mean, you have to be, right? If you're in these, pretty rough climates and stuff, you can't necessarily do that alone everywhere. So that would make a lot of sense. You spend time talking about their howls. I mean, again, if, maybe some folks have heard a wolf howl if they've, been somewhere pretty remote or camping or on a hike or something, maybe. But how? Tell us about this is how they're communicating with each other. So again, the listener keeps in mind, okay, they're moving about, they're adapting to different terrain and climates. They're having to cooperate. So obviously they got to talk to each other. They got to communicate. And you talk about how the different howls could be used for understanding territory, contact with each other. They like doing it as an affinity, maybe even expressing emotion. How do we understand that there's maybe individuality with the different howls, that there's different reasons for why they do them? How have we been able to, document and understand and study the way that they communicate?
Mm. Well, probably the best way to look at it is take a step back and think about how this howling evolved. So you have an animal that ranges really widely. So if you're looking for food that's difficult to get, there's not much in the environment, they tend to range quite widely, and kilometers, miles, they can be separated. So they need some way to stay in touch. So you can see how howling could have evolved at first merely as a way to keep in touch. But when you have such a social animal, when you have an animal that does have close social interactions with other members of the pack, and remember, howling is only the long range communication. When they're together, when they're nearby, there's very, very complex combination of different sounds that they use to convey much more information. But when they're apart, all they've got is the howls. Only howls is all you can hear at long range. So given that they have that social need, they have that communicative need, they use it in a different way when they're near to each other, makes perfect sense that also in their long-range communication, some of that need is going to be expressed. Am I saying one animal will go for a few miles looking for food? Am I saying I found food? Am I saying I haven't found food? I want to come back home. You can see that there's an advantage to different messages in different howls. Now, how much they do that, how much they don't do that, is not clear at the moment. We've got a good sense that could be the case, and there's even some work on the differences between those howls, how they vary between packs, between individuals, between contexts also. So we think that there probably is some information in there, but the important thing to remember is this is not words. We are not talking about an animal that communicates with words. We're not talking about one howl that means one thing and another howl that means another thing. We're talking about an animal that's communicating, and then is the animal that's hearing that sound, is that animal able to infer something about what the first animal is saying, thinking, feeling from the sound of the howl? Does a happy howl sound different from a sad howl? Does a hungry howl sound different from a full howl, and so on? It's not words, but it's still communication with meaning.
Now, just so I'm clear, you're saying that the howls is it's predominantly for long distance communication, less so from if they're just kind of together, in a pack and they're, sleeping together or whatever, they're running together. It's mostly used for long distance, maybe not exclusively for that, but mostly for long distance communication.
Well, with one big exception, of course. If you ever seen wolves, one thing they tend to do is, particularly when they're quite excited, so either happy or nervous, something like that, and they're all together, they'll howl. That howling is also an expression of emotion. When they're together, not necessarily when they're far apart and trying to communicate with each other. It's almost as if it is an irresistible way for them to express emotion. And that's not surprising. We shouldn't be too surprised about that, because social animals, especially animals that really, really, really depend on that social connection, they cannot live without it. So of course, when they get together, they want to reaffirm the fact they're together. Everything's okay. We're all here. And so the howling becomes a joyful and enjoyable event. It's something they're doing because they're glad, they're all together, they're all feeling safe, or they're all together and they're all feeling nervous, but it's that expression of social interaction that comes out as howling.
There's something very, I don't know. There's something very, very, very kind about that. I don't know. There's something very, very nice about knowing that they're together on something. There's something really, really nice about that. Maybe that's the social aspect of me coming out. I don't know. As a human, I don't know.
It shouldn't surprise us, right? There are many things. There are many things that are wrong about human ideas that we impose on animals that are wrong. There's many times that we do that. But we shouldn't be surprised when we take our understanding of social interactions and project them onto a social animal, right? That's actually probably more likely to be correct than not. So what we understand about social feelings of togetherness and social feelings of comfort and being in the group that we want to be in, it shouldn't surprise us that's also expressed in social animals.
Yeah. So you have dolphins that are really interesting. I've talked about it a little bit here before, how they communicate. So many folks might know that they echolocate. They have clicks. That people have tried to really kind of almost like with human language, try to map out how they have maybe names for each other, that they can talk at long distances again. I guess what is the one question I'm curious on your perspective here? I mean, because we're not exclusively water mammals, we're on land for the most part. I've heard that it can be hard to kind of study an underwater mammal and how they communicate. How much complexity and individuality do we think that dolphins have? And I guess, we kind of talked about in the beginning, you have a very socially complex animal, you're going to get probably more complex communication. And some people have, researched and hypothesized that, what's the level of intelligence that dolphins have? Are they, is there a consciousness kind of thing, all that? We don't have to have those conversations. But I am curious, though, about if they are very, highly social, at a level that maybe chimps and humans are, or closer to that. How complex do we think their communication is? How individualized is it? What can you, I guess, say about this bit with dolphins?
And they are social. They are very social. They have very complex social interactions. In particular, because the ocean is a big place and they move very freely within the ocean, they're often out of contact with members of their social group, potentially for very long periods of time, unlike wolves. So, a dolphin might meet another dolphin and then not see them again for months, perhaps. So a lot of the social intelligence that this species has built up is to do with recognizing individuals, with remembering which individuals you cooperate with well, which ones you don't cooperate with well. And that's a function of this sort of slightly diffuse, what we call fission fusion. They come together and then they break apart, and then they come back again together and break into other groups. That's a really complex social interaction. And that's probably where this large, this quite developed intelligence comes from. And then the question is, how is that manifested in communication? Well, for one thing, you've got to be able to identify individuals. So it shouldn't surprise us that dolphins have this amazing ability to recognize individuals from the sounds that they make. But the other interesting thing, because they're not the only animals that live in that kind of social context, but because they live in the water, because they live in the ocean, they're very constrained how they can communicate, right? You can't use vision, can't see anything underwater, basically. You have to use a particular kind of sound, and that particular sound, these whistles and clicks, constrain what they can convey. In some ways, it's less flexible than the kind of language that we have. Now, we don't know what the dolphins are saying to each other. The truth is, as with wolves, as with all of these species, we really don't know just how much information they're conveying. And it's a little difficult to know how we would know. People are working on it, but it is a really challenging problem, precisely because they are in a very difficult environment to be in. But just how much information can be contained in those whistles and in those clicks isn't immediately clear. The only way you can understand that, the only way we can get to the bottom of this, is by observing them in the wild, by watching what they're doing while they're making these sounds and trying to tie the two together. It's a complicated business.
Yeah, it's very, very complicated. It's interesting to think about if they weren't in water, how they would communicate. Of course, that's not where their environment is. But I also wonder, there are other animals. Obviously, I mean, the ocean's massive. Most of the planet is water, and other animals that they will sometimes kind of swim with or travel with. You've seen them with other types of animals as well. And it is interesting to think, is there this kind of cross communication between species with other animals that might also use echolocation, or they might use some type of clicks? It's a very interesting, kind of fantasy to entertain, of like, wow, is there this cross animal communication kind of thing in a marine mammal, which is, obviously there's whales and there's orcas and there's many different types of other animals. So it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think you'd have to. The question you have to ask yourself, of course, is why would this have evolved? What is it? What's driving this? Now, if you have two species that cooperate really closely together, and there are species that have some kind of really tight interaction, then you can see that evolving. But if we go back to this idea that it's the social interactions that are driving complex communication, then you'd have to posit that there were social interactions between the dolphins and the pilot whales, for instance, or whatever, which may be the case in some instances. But I suppose what I'm saying is dolphins aren't going to talk to pilot whales just because they can.
Right.
There has to be some sort of social driver of that.
Right. Yeah. Right. So the chapter on parrots was interesting. So one of the non-mammals in the book. And many times we think of, corvids, so ravens, crows, as primates with feathers and very intelligent, all these things. But parrots seem to have a different evolutionary path with intelligence and with communicating. And so, obviously, for people that have had parrots as pets, they obviously live very long and all these things, but many people will say, well, when they're, saying swear words, or when they're maybe saying a phrase, or even sometimes sentences, they're just, really good at imitating the sounds that we're making. It's the mimicry. That's all it is. It's not that they're actually able to talk and to do all these things. And maybe unclear on this, right? So what is the kind of, I guess, line thereof? Is it just imitation, or do they really have this capacity, this, maybe there's intelligence, maybe there's language aspects in their brain to actually talk, whether it's, intelligible, comprehensible, language that they can do free form, maybe less so, but maybe there is something there. What can you say about this piece of imitation versus, actually talking with parrots?
Yeah, it is a mystery, and it is a really interesting. It's a really interesting case, but quite apart from what the experiments with parrots have shown us, and I think they have shown us that parrots are at least capable of genuinely learning aspects of human language rather than just mimicking. But I think first you've got to ask yourself, why do they mimic? Right? Most animals don't do that. There's got to be a role for this. And if there's a role for mimicry, that implies that there's some kind of complex social interaction going on. If you just have a mated pair that are living on their own, it's hard to see what role mimicry would would provide. Mimicry seems to be important in establishing social hierarchies. So many parrots do live in larger groups, perhaps not as cohesive as a wolf pack, more like dolphin groups where they sort of they recognize individuals and come back together and then don't see them for a while. But I don't think the mimicry is a red herring here. I think it's really important because it shows that they are paying attention, that they've evolved to have a great deal of brain power put aside for processing that vocal communication. And that means there must be some relevance to it.
Is the mimicry just with humans in speech, or they mimic other sounds and animals?
That's something they do in the wild.
Well.
They definitely do that in the wild.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm saying that this is likely to be an indication of complex communication. Now, we know from experiments in captivity that parrots are capable of learning the essence of human language and understanding human language. So not only do they have that inherent ability to learn these things, and they have in the wild this mimicry ability, which seems to be related to their vocal interaction between the parrots in the wild. So there's something very, very interesting going on there. Clearly complex communication. And I think that the best thing we can say about it is that parrots seem to have, as well as a few other species, parrots seem to have some kind of innate ability to understand language. They don't seem to use language in the wild. Okay, I'm not saying that parrots speak in the wild. It's not like Dr. Dolittle. But somewhere in their brains, they have the mechanism, the capacity to understand that. And that's a very important insight into evolution of language and evolution of human language, because over and over again, not just with communication, with all aspects of animals, plants, everything, you see a trait, an ability, a property evolving to fulfill some role and then adapting to fulfill a completely different role. So these animals could have these these mental capacities to perform a certain function because it's good for, I don't know, living in a large group. But then in one species, in our ancestors, that ability was taken and adapted and just sort of went off in a different direction and became something else. So it's not that surprising that we see certain species having an element of rudimentary linguistic ability.
Yeah. I'm recalling, it's been a while now, a couple of years, but I had a wonderful conversation with Anton Martino Trustwell, who wrote a wonderful book called The Parrot in the Mirror, and he's down in Australia, I believe, and he wrote this book basically on the intelligence of parrots. I don't recall, it's been a while, so I can't quite recall the specifics, but it was less about, like, I mean, there was a discussion about obviously language and their mimicry and stuff, but it was more about their brain capacity and how they have, obviously very dense, or I should say very tightly packed brains, because, they're much smaller, but their ability and their capacity is quite spectacular. And again, people have said this as well with, like I mentioned, crows and ravens. I had a conversation about that as well, and I'm drawing a blank on Nikki Clayton, right? Is that right? Yeah. And so it's interesting to see, when I was reading this part of your book, I was like, yeah, it's so interesting how parrots really just kind of stick out a little bit, and I think most of them, if I'm not mistaken, are south of the equator. I mean, we don't really see parrots in Norway. I mean, in terms of the wild. I mean, obviously, people bring them, up here and stuff. But
I think the thing about parrots, what makes them, what puts them in this story, is they're problem solvers. Like wolves, right?
Yeah.
Like wolves, like dolphins. Their niche involves solving problems. It's not an easy life being a parrot, right? You're looking for you're exploiting quite a complex niche. You're looking for particular kinds of food that are very that are very nutritious and worth looking for, but they're hard to find. You've got to figure out which nuts and are they ripe? Are they poisonous? How do you open a nut? They're problem-solving animals, and problem-solving plus social. That's the sort of the magic combination.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think for a lot of people, problem solving is one of the key elements of intelligence. It's not the only thing, but I think it's a critical thing. I think is how do you problem solve novel situations, and how do you continue to do that, in different ones, on and on and on. Those are kind of the basic building blocks of intelligence, of some basic form of intelligence. So parrots are super, super fascinating. So I'll give you as much runway as you want here. You've, I believe your past research was on this animal called the hyrax. A lot of people won't be familiar with the hyrax, and it's nice that they, this animal gets their time in the sun here in the book, and you give them a lot of time. And so I know you've done research on this, so you can go as detailed as you want here, but maybe tell us what the hyrax is, what kind of animal this is, how complex their learned syntax is with vocalizations, songs, different types of songs. Just you can go as much as you want on this. I found this super interesting because I also didn't really know about the hyrax, and so it was really, really nice to learn about an animal. It was pretty novel for me. So yeah, tell us about the hyrax.
The hyraxes have a certain place in my book, partly because that was the topic of my PhD research, but they're illustrating a really important point. So the hyraxes are, they basically look a little bit like rabbits without ears, I suppose. At least they did to the early Phoenicians who went to Spain and thought, oh, look at all those rabbits, they look like hyraxes. But yeah, they're small furry animals. They live in the Middle East and down the east coast of Africa. And they live in large groups. They don't have a particularly complex social structure. It's a fairly typical, in many mammals, you have one dominant male surrounded by females and some juvenile males that then get thrown out when they reach maturity and so on. And they defend a territory. And they make this incredible sound. I mean, they make so much noise. They just go on and on and on and on with this complex sound, these complex songs that they make. And it's the male that sings. So unlike in a lot of other species, it's the male advertising his dominance and his territory, primarily his dominance. And like with a lot of birds, it's the complexity of his song that indicates how dominant he is. So if you sing a simple song, you're not that smart. If you can sing a really complex song, then you're a really strong, healthy, dominant male.
Why song, do you think? That's an interesting. I guess vocally, it's interesting. I mean, people know.
I mean, it's something that's broadcast over a wide area. When you live in a relatively large territory, you want to make sure that your message gets out across that territory. And it's quite interesting when sometimes you see hyraxes and they live in like a string of dens, like one after over. Maybe 100 meters between each den, but you've got you can almost feel the territory around each of these dens are broadcast by the songs of the males.
It's very
What's really interesting about them is that they're not saying anything complicated. There's nothing of complex. There's no complex meaning in these songs. They're just saying, I'm the dominant male, come and mate with me. If you're a female, if you're a male, go away. That's the message. So they don't have a need to put complex information like perhaps dolphins, parrots, humans would do, but they still have complexity. And this is really key because complexity in communication arises for simple reasons. You see it in birdsong as well. Right? You think of a songbird just singing a complex song over and over. They're not saying anything any more complicated than this is my territory. But it's the complexity itself that's the message. And what's interesting here is complexity evolves for its own sake. So you have this wide range of animals, hyraxes, birds, just about everything, that need to say something complex because the complexity is the message. And the way they do that is by combining notes in complicated ways, really complicated combinations of notes. So even in animals that don't have to say very much, they still combine sounds in very complex ways. And that's sort of like the basis, that's the foundation of complex communication. You can see then other species building on that, as I said, taking that, evolving it in different directions and building complex meaning into the complex information, in the complex communication channel.
Yeah, the complexity piece is really interesting. It's interesting how there's not, in terms of content, it's maybe devoid of content or very minimal content, but there is complexity in the way that it's communicating. That again, kind of what you were saying in the beginning. What's the evolutionary function of that? It's like, well, it sounds like it's less about communicating, poetry and written prose and all these things that maybe humans do. It's more of there are 2 or 3 messages I need to send out, and then the more complex, the more maybe important, or more this is key, and less about exactly or specifically what's being said. That's a fascinating piece. That, I mean, again, to the average person that doesn't study this, that would you would say, well, something's going on. There's obviously complexity, but what's actually being said here, and to know that not a whole lot actually is very, very fascinating to understand. I mean, there's some humans I know like that, so a lot of complexity is not really saying anything. But yeah, that's really, really, and I think to find again all of these different types of animals, different types of mammals, mostly communicating in different ways. It's not like it's the same. Oh, you're a mammal, you're social. Okay, you do it the same. It's all very different, which is really cool. It's a really, really cool feature in nature. Really, really, really nice. So you move to the apes. You talk about gibbons and chimps, and then us at the end. Gibbons are gibbons. Are they endangered? They're not extinct, but there's not many of them left, right? They're usually kind of pocketed in one area in Africa, right? They're not many left
Asia,
in the world.
they're
In Asia, excuse me. Yeah, tell us, I guess, about. There's this interesting thing that you put in the book, which was a nice reminder, is gibbons are further back in the evolutionary tree, maybe 20 million years ago, of a common ancestor. And so chimps and bonobos are closer to us, and yet you talk about how they also have songs. They have a certain type of syntax. You give a nice comparison in the book of the syntax diagram for the hyrax and then for the gibbon, and it's very different. I'm assuming for brain development, things like that. But yeah, talk about their ability to communicate in different ways. They also use song, and they, what that looks like further back from a common ancestor with humans and the other apes. Yeah, what is this kind of picture here?
Yeah, gibbons are a really interesting and really important part of the story, particularly as we start to think about think about where human language came from. And that's mostly because if you look at our closest relatives, so chimpanzees and bonobos, and even if you look at gorillas and orangutans, who are slightly more distant ancestors, they don't actually say that much. I mean, they do have sounds, and they certainly do make sounds, but their communication is much more non-vocal. It's much more gestural. So that's a little odd, right? But if you go a little bit further back to our common ancestors with the gibbons, the gibbons diverged from our lineage quite a long time ago, and they are incredibly vocal. I mean, they sort of make this really, really vocal behavior, and it has a number of roles. So It's mostly a sort of a male-female duet song role. So the males and the females sing together, essentially. Um, but it is a very, very complex song. And unlike the hyraxes, where we think, okay, this is just a male being complex because he's showing off and he wants to make a complex song, there seems to be something more going on. There seems to be something more going on with the gibbons. Now, remember, primates have exploited a particular niche that includes a lot of problem solving. Primates have a particular kind of intelligence. They've evolved to live in this very complex, challenging environment of the jungle where there are many, many different kinds of trees. You've got to figure out which one has got good food and protect it from others and so on. So they've got big brains. They're very intelligent and they're social. And all of these things are starting to come together. You could sort of see the ingredients being mixed together, and we're almost ready to be in a place where one of those species could take that mixture and evolve and develop something more like language. But here are the gibbons. They're around today. They're really vocal. They've got really complex vocal communication. And the gorillas don't, and chimps barely do, and something strange happened there. We don't know whether the common ancestor of humans and gibbons was very vocal, and then the chimps and gorillas sort of lost that ability, or whether that complex vocal behavior arose independently, both in gibbons and in humans. And it doesn't matter so much. What we know is that all apes have brains that are capable of understanding these complex combinations of sounds. Gibbons do it a lot with their vocal sounds. Chimps and gorillas seem to have an understanding of it, even if they don't use it in the wild.
Yeah.
But yes, as you say, gibbon song is tremendously complex, and we believe it holds meaning, not as much meaning as language, but at least a number of different potential meanings. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading this and yeah, I was struck by it because of how further back the common ancestor is, and it's like, oh, evolution doesn't obviously work in a straight line, obviously, all the time, and we do have convergent evolution, but it was curious. I mean, the way you said it was very nice. There was that chimps and bonobos and gorillas can understand, but maybe they don't talk as much. Interesting that gibbons do, and I think it'll be interesting to see as more people do research to see what it is that they might, what is that complexity about, or what they might be up to with the way they interact or they communicate. So interesting. I was curious about this. This is sort of like a footnote here, I guess. But you talk about chimps, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this was you say in the book that this was the one animal you didn't observe in the wild, or something. And so, how much of that was like, I guess, an impact? I mean, we have so much research. I mean, you reference obviously Goodall and her work, and many people have done a lot of work on chimps. I mean, obviously, nothing beats seeing chimps in the wild, but yeah, I mean, what do you think, it was really that much of an impact, or you were still able to get the essence of, they have all these different ways of communicating, and you talk about that, but yeah, less of an impact, or because I mean, there is such a dearth of literature out there now.
Yeah, and of course, you can understand animals, and you can by reading about them. I mean, I hope you can. Otherwise, why they write the book?
Right.
But I'm always struck by and want to convey this idea that you got to see what these animals are like in the wild. You've just got to. It's there are too many preconceptions, even with all of the wonderful nature documentaries that we've got. It's understanding that the way these animals that behave in the wild, that's the key thing. Now, I'm really lucky that I know a lot of people who've worked many, many years with chimps and lots of conversations with them, and I don't think that I don't think I've said anything wrong because of that. But yeah, it is really key that one gets as much of a feel as possible from their behavior in the wild. And in this case, because of the whole COVID situation, chimps are very susceptible to COVID-19, unfortunately. So that was just not an option in this case.
Yeah, of course. So chimps, I mean, they, like you said just a minute ago, it seems like they can comprehend a bit. I mean, they can understand language. They definitely have some, obviously, intelligence, but how much is the extent of their expressive language? I guess. I mean, there's some, I guess, receptive language that they have, but what's I guess the extent of their expressive language? They can learn a lot. Obviously, it's genetically. Similar DNA to humans, all that stuff that we know. But I mean, it does seem to be one of the things that set us apart from chimps is, we talk a lot, probably too much, and we write things and we talk about things. But chimps seem to not as much, but they do seem to really comprehend. What's the idea here on why is it just evolution stopped there, or why do they not expressively talk as much as maybe humans?
So evolution doesn't stop. Chimps have
right.
evolving
On this aspect, I should say.
Just as long as we have. But their environment and the niche that they live in doesn't require that kind of complex communication. And probably the reason that it doesn't is that they live in relatively small groups. I mean, large groups, 30 individuals or something like that, but still relatively small. And we kind of think that we know, we could speculate a little bit about where humans came from, but we suspect that the common ancestor of humans and chimps was basically fairly chimp-like, at least living in the jungle. And then as the jungle shrunk and the climate dried, and then some of them went and took advantage of the sort of the grassland environment and probably started living in larger groups. And it's that difference between the size of the group that you live in and the kind of way that you find your food. So in the case of our ancestors, probably hunting, a lot more hunting required. It's a complex interplay between conditions that drove this need for more complex communication. So it's not the case that in some ways we're better or more evolved than chimps. We just it's a different environment. So chimps communicate exactly as much as they need to. Now we know that they actually do have quite a complex communication system, but it's mostly gestural. There are sounds, and they do use sounds, and they use quite a lot of sounds with different meaning. But two things are interesting. One is that there's a lot of gesture involved in it, and that may make a lot of sense when essentially you're communicating with other animals that are close by you. Whereas if you're off in the savannah, perhaps the other individuals will be on the other side, circling a zebra or something like that to hunt it, and you have to call out. But the really interesting thing with chimps is that they do seem to be able to pick up human language. Now, it's really controversial. A lot of these experiments about whether chimps can talk or whether Coco the gorilla can talk are very controversial, but there seems to be something there. Very much like the parrots. They have that innate mental capacity to understand the nature of language, even if they don't use it. And it's quite likely that mental capacity evolved for other reasons, was present in our ancestor, our common ancestor with chimps 6 million years ago. The chimp descendants went one way and didn't really develop it into a language. Our ancestors went another way, and that same ability was then developed into the kind of language that we have today.
Yeah, it's such a marvel, right, of how these things work, and we'll never know the why. I mean, we don't know the why for a lot of things, but this thing with language specifically is interesting, and how there's different iterations of it. Some can understand and comprehend. Some use very rudimentary or mimicry. Some have, like in humans, very abstract, complex language. It's very interesting to see like all the different kind of iterations of it with different, at the very least with different mammals. So now I was curious, why did you put a chapter in the book on humans? I got to the end of the book and I was like, oh, okay, and then I was like, oh, humans. Yeah, I was all jazzed up about animals. Why animals talk. Okay, cool. And then I was like, oh, humans. So I mean, yeah, we're animals, but we're human animals, I guess. You talked about non-human animals, but I was curious about that, right? I mean, you could tell us about language. I mean, obviously, hundreds, thousands of books written on language and humans, but yeah, why did you include a chapter on us?
I mean, I think you made it clear right at the very beginning, right? We want to talk to animals, but what we don't often realize is that the nature of the communication is different. The nature is different. Whatever happens, we're confident of that. Now, if we want to understand what that means in terms of how we can or can't talk to animals, we need to understand what is different. What is different about the way we communicate and the way other species communicate? And there is difference. I mean, there are clear differences. So really the chapter on humans was to make a stab at explaining how we diverged from all of these other things that I've talked about. Why humans are so different. What's the nature of that gulf, if it is a gulf? And if it isn't a gulf, or even if it is, how are the foundations of what we do, how we speak, how are they based on all of these animal abilities? Because although language is human language is unquestionably qualitatively different from any other species on the planet, there seem to be these common foundations, these common building blocks that have been something else has been added, but those fundamental building blocks are there. And understanding where they lie and where the similarities lie and where the differences lie, that's crucial to understanding how we can and can't communicate with animals.
How much of, I guess, human language really is special and unique? I mean, I always, kind of sort of shy away from that. I mean, obviously it is different, of course, but, I mean, I think like, dolphins clicking and echolocating underwater is something humans can't do. We can't talk underwater to each other, right? That's their environment, that's their home. But is human language, really, I guess maybe special is not the right word, but I mean, it's different. Is it really that unique? Is it really, do we get our due for that and say, yeah, that's, certain animals have this, other animals have this, and, we got language. That's our thing that sets us apart. Is it fair to say that, or is that too much?
I think, I mean, you got to be a bit careful with how you define things. Is it unique? Yeah. Yes, it's unique. Of course, it's unique. Unique means that no one else has it, and no one else has it. Sure. So it's unique. Is it better? I think is the implied question underneath that, and that's a question for philosophers. Right? Is it better as an evolutionary biologist? Is it better? No, it's evolved just like dolphin communication has evolved. It's been through the same 4 billion years of evolution, and so it's suited for the particular application that it has. As dolphins are suited for the particular application that they have. Now, you could argue, it's better in some ways because we can build computers and spaceships and houses and things like that. But as you say, we can't talk underwater. So I think it's misleading to go down the better route. But it's absolutely acceptable to say it's unique. Yes, it is. It is different, and you can see that in the evolutionary record. You can see that these animals that shared a common ancestor with us just 6 million years ago, is really not that long. They don't do this. Something happened really very, very quickly in those 6 million years. Something radically changed in the way that the animals communicated. At some point, 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago, maybe, something changed radically. And that is something that is different. It is qualitatively different. It is unique. It is important to know about. It's not better. It's just different.
I fully agree with you. That's a great way to frame it. So I guess the final question is what do you think? I mean, obviously, you're doing this work, and there's other people, colleagues and things like that are doing this. Many wonderful people are studying animals, and they're studying animal communication. In the future, do you see a space where I'll just say humans, but maybe other animals, but can we communicate better or more effectively with other animals from other species, and should we?
I think it's got to be advantageous to understand animals better. And the advantages of understanding animals better are huge for issues like conservation, also for ethical reasons. If we're causing harm. Sometimes you can't avoid causing harm, but it's important to have that conversation, and simply because it's the nature of humans to be curious. We have to understand the world around us. If we don't try and understand the world around us, we've stopped being human. So I think we've got to keep doing that. How far will we get? We've got to set our goals logically, rationally, scientifically. If our goal is to speak to the animals like Dr. Dolittle, we ain't going to do it. We're not going to do it because they're not doing it. They are not communicating like that. If we want to have a sort of Google Translate conversation with an animal that doesn't have words, that doesn't even maybe have a single meaning to the sounds that they make. Go back to the example of wolf howls. If a wolf howl is expressing emotion in some way, how happy they are, how hungry they are, that's not something that's directly translatable. So we have to be rational in setting our goals. Having said that, there's a lot of optimism about using AI, using various machine learning tools to understand more about what the information content of animal calls are. But let's be realistic about this sort of word for word translation. That will only work if there are words.
Yeah. I fully agree. It's something that's really exciting to see and to read and to hear when people, there's a new paper that comes out, or there's a new finding, or there's new ways of cataloging things. It's always very exciting because we're not the only species on the planet. We share a home with so many species. It would be nice to figure out some way of some kind of translatable something. It would be wonderful, at least to know what they're thinking and up to.
I mean, we will. This is very much what the way the direction that things are going. But the bottom line, the thing you've got to remember is, we want to understand the animals on their terms. We want to understand them as they are, rather than imposing our vision of how we want them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it encourages me that most of the people I've talked to and people I see, that most people have that kind of attitude and approach, which is very, very encouraging. Arik, this has been so much fun. I love talking about animals and about the science of animals and communication, things like that. Your book is absolutely a treat. It's wonderful. It's lovely, and so I highly recommend people get out, at least in the U.S., pick it up, and then in August, and folks already where it's at in the U.K. should pick it up. And this was such a wonderful conversation. So big thanks for coming on and sharing all your wisdom.
It's been great fun. Thank you.
Of course.